now I'm talking to you about my latest obsession. And in my early talks, when I gave talks on why we get fat, I always had a section where I gave some basically photos, and I said, this is how the German researchers, I'm channeling how German researchers pre-World War II thought about obesity, and it would be 3 slides. And now, living in 2023, you can actually get access to all of the German literature. So let me back up a step. Until World War II, Germany and Austria were the sort of apex of biomedical research in the world. So the United States had a tiny bit of sort of world-class medical research, and the best was being done in Europe, and the best in Europe was being done in Germany and Austria. So just like the best physics was done for the most part in Germany and Austria by people whose names we know well, like Einstein and Schrödinger and Heisenberg and Pauli, so was the best medical research, except they tended to get ignored. Their research tended to vanish with World War II. So when I wrote my books, I had access to the few papers or books that were written in English by these researchers and a couple of books that were translated. And now in 2023, you can get it all. Between Google Books and Springer Verlag, which are the big German publisher, they have a website where they make their research available, the literature back to the 19th century, and ChatGPT translates it. It's crazy. Like, all you have to do is copy and paste, and it translates faster than you can read. And it does it from poor quality PDFs. It's unbelievable. And so in the past 6 months, my wife is now comparing me to Jack Nicholson in The Shining. Because all I do is I sit up in my office, which is like this widow's walk on the top of this old house in Oakland, and I translate 100-year-old German literature. It's crazy. And today I'm going to give you a slideshow on it. Okay, so you could kind of see what this stuff reveals. And imagine if this was physics, okay, and all the work done by physicists, these guys, Einstein, Schrödinger and his cat, and Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle, and Pauli, and all these people that had never crossed the Atlantic and we never heard of it. And instead, young US physicists in the 1950s had said, well, we can do physics. Cool. And everything we'd been living on since had been dated to the 1950s and whatever these young kids thought they could do. That's what happened in medicine, okay, and particularly in obesity. And so now, boom, you get access to what they were doing all along and how they were thinking. So, and as usual, I have lovely photos. Okay, so first rule, this is my favorite quote on science these days, and I think whenever you're listening to a talk, whenever you're reading a book, whenever you're on a website, this is what you have to keep in mind. Rudolf Virchow was the sort of preeminent German internal medicine pathology specialist of the second half of the 19th century. He basically directed attention in medicine to the cell, so the cell theory of disease is all Virchow, and then he was kind of passed along when Robert Koch and others came along with infectious disease theories. Virchow said in 1847, which you can now translate, how then can one with certainty determine which of two concurrent phenomena is cause and which effect, and whether either is in effect cause and both are not simultaneously effects of a third factor, or indeed, if you'll pardon my periods, that each is not the effect of two quite distinct causes. So you hear a lot, even in talks today, you hear, people who exercise live longer than people who don't. That's an observation. We all know that association doesn't imply causality. This is what Virchow's talking about. Do people who exercise live longer because they exercise? Or maybe they exercise because they're healthier? And they live longer because they're healthier, and maybe they'd live even longer if they didn't exercise. That's a possibility. I lived in Paris in the 80s, and they had the second or third longest longevity in the world, and nobody exercised except the men. The husbands were in bed with their friends' wives and vice versa. So maybe that counts. Okay, keep this in mind, because in obesity we had two phenomena. Basically, okay, let me backstep. We're going to get to this. Why this? Okay, so this is a headline from the Wall Street Journal last week because of GLP-1 agonists, Wegovy, Ozempic, settles the obesity debate. It's biology over willpower. So another way to think of this talk is, why are we settling this debate in 2023, and why do we think we needed a drug to do it? Should it have been settled 100 years ago? And part of the problem is we have two observations that require explanation, okay? So one of them is this association between fat accumulation, between obesity and eating a lot. And this is how Arnoldo Cantani was a leading Italian diabetes specialist in the second half of the 19th century. And by that I meant he had a clinic where he treated patients with diabetes. He actually locked them away and fed them only fatty meat and vegetables, and wouldn't let them out of the room until he knew he could trust them to only eat that. And Cantani gave a series of lectures in Naples in 1875 that a lot of these books were a series of lectures that were turned into books. Some individuals, he said, have a rather sluggish and slow material metabolism, easily gaining weight even without consuming more food than others, who with the same diet and occupation remain thin. Others have a very rapid and active material metabolism, allowing them to eat a lot but always remaining lean. He's assuming about the metabolism and the active and the sluggish. But what they're trying to explain is, why is it some people get fat and don't eat a lot, and some people remain lean and do eat a lot? And what are we going to do with that? How are we going to explain the fat accumulation if we can disassociate it from the overeating? He also said the fat person is a sick person, and they knew this 140 years ago. Every person physiologically needs a certain amount of fat, but if this amount exceeds, if there's an imbalance between their fats and albuminates, proteins, then the person has become sick. Excessive adiposity is undoubtedly one of the most serious constitutional diseases. So these are the observations that we're trying to explain. We know that some people get fat and eat a lot. We know that some people get fat and don't eat a lot. We know that some people stay lean and eat a lot. But we know that once you do put on excess weight, once you've put on significant excess weight, this is a disease and it's got serious consequences. So in the second half of the 19th century, there were two hypotheses developed to explain this, two entirely different scientific disciplines in effect. The first one was nutrition science, which focused on the calorie, on energy balance. And here's a quick tour. It begins with Lavoisier, a brilliant Frenchman who unfortunately had his life cut short by the guillotine in around 1790. That's not an association, that's cause and effect. Lavoisier did a famous experiment with literally a guinea pig. That's why we refer to guinea pigs, in which he showed that respiration is basically the same thing as combustion, that we burn oxygen and produce carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, whichever. And you get basically the same energy produced. In 1850, Clausius, a German, a Pole elaborated the first law of thermodynamics. Energy conservation, okay, the energy change in a system is equal to the energy in minus the energy out. In 1866, two Germans, Voigt and Pettenkofer, built the first room-sized calorimeter, so you could actually measure how much energy a human being, or in this picture a dog, would give off over 24 hours. So you could measure the energy in by taking foods and burning them in a calorimeter and seeing how much heat is produced. But now you can measure the energy out. So now you could start to measure energy balance. And in 1888, Zunz, another German, created portable calorimeters. So you could actually take a patient who's in a hospital or metabolic ward, and you could take a calorimeter to the patient, and you could measure basically their metabolism, how much energy they're expending. This is where the idea of basal metabolism became popular, because you wanted to measure something that you thought was fixed. And you weren't measuring 24-hour expenditure, because you couldn't have people walk around with this thing for 24 hours. So you would bring it in the morning after they haven't eaten for 12 hours, and you would measure their basal metabolism. And that became a sort of one of the crucial elements that you measured in these studies. And one of the keys in understanding this kind of science and medical science in general is that the physicians and the researchers doing it could only learn what they had the capability of seeing, of studying. If they can measure energy expenditure, they could create theories about energy expenditure. If they can measure energy intake and energy expenditure, they can create theories about energy balance. But they're not able to measure anything else. That's all they can measure. So that's what they did measure. And by 1899, Atwater, an American, and Rosa, they had gone to Germany. They had studied Pettenkofer and Voigt's apparatus. They built, Francis Benedict helped them build their own, and they did these extensive studies showing that the first law holds for humans because it wasn't clear. And then in 1903, we finally have a theory that obesity is an energy balance disorder. So there was always this idea that people who suffer with obesity tend to eat too much and they tend to be inactive. Now you actually had a theory that defined it. And this is Carl von Noorden's theory. Von Noorden did publish a couple of books in English. He talked about the energy exchange. Obesity is a result of a long continued disproportion between the amount of food consumed and then metabolized. From this, it follows that obesity may occur as a result of an increased food supply with normal energy expenditure, or a normal food supply with diminished energy expenditure. This is the energy balance hypothesis put forth in paper. He actually talked about calories, and you could have a combination of both conditions. And he broke it up into exogenous versus endogenous obesity. Exogenous obesity is caused by external factors, okay? Somebody eats too much. So you have an association. You have somebody who's overweight, and you see that they like to eat, or they have they're having a binge behavior, or they're gluttons, and then you blame the obesity on the overeating because that's what you see. Virchow might have said, well, how do you know they're not both caused by another underlying factor? They don't necessarily have to be causal just because you're seeing the two simultaneously, but von Noorden assumed they were. And then you had obesity due to retarded metabolism. So this would explain the people who seem to get fat whether they ate a lot or not. Okay, or particularly the ones who didn't eat a lot, and the world was full of them. They didn't have to measure them. They didn't need epidemiologic studies. Everyone said, look, I know my patients. They're not gluttons. They've never been gluttons, and yet they accumulate a lot of fat. How do we explain that? And that was endogenous obesity, and because all they could measure was energy expenditure, the assumption was that was caused by a metabolism that didn't produce enough energy. Okay, and then in 1930-31, I've talked about Newberg in previous studies. This American comes along, Louis Newberg, and he says he can experimentally prove that all obesity is exogenous. It's always caused by eating too much. Publishes 3 papers from 1929 to 1931. All of them are based on the same evidence where he took, it's hard to tell from the papers, but it seems like maybe 5 or 6 subjects with obesity and semi-starved them in his laboratory and compared them to one subject, lean subject, and said if you semi-starve them, eventually they all lose weight at pretty much the same rate that you would expect from the laws of thermodynamics. Therefore, all obesity is exogenous, caused by eating too much. We wish to commit ourselves, Newberg said, to the statement that obesity is never directly caused by abnormal metabolism, but that is always due to food habits not adjusted to the metabolic requirement, either the ingestion of more food than is normally needed or the failure to reduce the intake in response to a lowered requirement. So one way or the other, this is a problem of willpower. People are either eating too much or they're not expending as much as they used to, and they're not reining their appetites in, okay? And all of what we believe about obesity, and I'll come back to Newberg at the very end, stems from Newberg's work. If there was a Einstein in the obesity field, it's Louis Newberg. The difference is Einstein was right, Newberg was wrong. But didn't matter, because not that many people were doing science. And by the 1930s, German science was beginning to fade because they had a Nazi problem in Germany, also cause and effect. We'll get to that. Okay, so now let's go to the science of fat metabolism. We just did a very quick scan through the science of energy balance and nutrition. I've talked about that before. This is an entirely different field. okay? These are different researchers doing something different. They are studying the nature of fat tissue. And you can kind of date this to the 1870s when a fellow named Taubes, I don't even know his first name because I haven't been able to find it yet, did a very careful study where he studied the development of fat tissue. Basically, they would take animals and they would get the fetuses from the hospital, and they would study the development of the fat microscopically. It was as the field of microscopy was evolving and the field of histology was evolving and different staining techniques were evolving. These people wanted to understand where fat tissue came from. And Taubes said fat is a separate organ. Fat cells are always a different organ. And they don't develop just from connective tissue. And this guy Fleming, Walter Fleming, whose first name I do know, said, no, you're wrong. It's connective tissue filling up with fat. And if fat cells are just connective tissue filling up with fat, then it's easy to imagine that when people eat too much, the fat just sort of oozes into the fat cells, into the connective tissue, and you get an excess of fat. And for the next 50 years, basically people confirmed Fleming's view until the 1920s, 50 years later, when a fellow named Wasserman came along and proved Fleming was wrong and Taubes was mostly right. But by that time, the idea that fat was just connective tissue expanding with fat had sort of settled into the zeitgeist, the German term. Cantani put it this way. So Cantani, when he was writing about the nature of fat tissue in 1879, said, look, we're more inclined to accept Taubes' theory than Fleming's. The notion of reducing the entire deposition of adipose tissue to a purely passive action by the connective tissue is difficult for us to comprehend, because if this was true in effect, everyone would get fat, and most people don't get fat. So, but Cantani was relatively unique, and as I said, other people came along. Their microscopy and histology techniques were not that good, and they decided that maybe Fleming had gotten it right. Beginning in the very early 20th century, and I have to say, all of this research could be dated earlier, okay? I'm dating it to the major names and the articles I could pull. But if I spend my whole life continuing to pull articles going further back in time, my marriage will end, and I will never get this book written. In 1901, Froelich diagnosed, Froelich, who was I forget if he was an Austrian or a German, diagnosed a case of excess fat accumulation in somebody he diagnosed as having a tumor in the pituitary gland, the hypophysis. But they didn't have acromegaly, they weren't giants, they weren't excessively tall, it was just excessively fat. And these patients also had very small genitalia, but I decided that I couldn't show genitalia in these photos because for all I know, I'd get arrested for child porn. I have no idea what the rules are about so you will get photos of naked people, but no genitalia. And if you don't like photos of naked people, you feel free to. They're all from these textbooks and these articles. So Froelich identified this as probably being due to a tumor in the pituitary gland. Clearly, it was somehow affecting the sex hormones as well. And I should say, at this point in time, 1901, so the science of endocrinology itself only dates to about 1869, and a Frenchman named Brown-Segard. The term endocrinology had not even been invented yet. The term hormones had not been invented yet. All they could tell was that there were certain disorders that could be linked to certain problems with endocrine glands. They called them ductless glands back then. And we'll get into it, eunuchoid obesity. Okay, clearly these are people who had been castrated for whatever reason. They were young. They tended to be either very tall or very fat, or fatter than normal and taller than normal. So you could link their castration and whatever the testicles or the female sex hormones are putting out to somehow to fat accumulation and growth. And because you could also link damage to the pituitary, it turned out actually to be the hypothalamus. But the tumor was in the pituitary, and you could link that to underdeveloped sexual characteristics. There was clearly a link between something that the brain was doing, either through the nervous system or through these hormones, to sex hormones and sexual development. So they start thinking, and while they're doing it, this is how they're looking at their patients. They're actually describing the patient's fat accumulation, what they're seeing. In this case, he has lost 3 kilograms since the thyroid treatment. They knew that if you gave patients thyroid extracts, some of them would actually lose weight, and they knew that thyroid had an effect on energy expenditure because they could measure that with their calorimeters. So this became a theory. It didn't work for everyone, and it eventually faded. Nevertheless, he still presents the appearance of a well-nourished person. The fingers are thick, the hands appear well padded. The most significant accumulation of fat is found in the skin of the trunk, especially in the abdomen around the buttocks. The thighs are so substantiated that they seem to envelop the genitalia to a great extent. The genitalia itself, normally developed for his age, seemed to be surrounded by these fat accumulations. By the way, all these quotes are courtesy of ChatGPT. I have checked many of them, but I don't check all of them. And as you've heard, ChatGPT will hallucinate. Okay, I've caught it hallucinating in some of my translations. To my embarrassment, after I passed it along to someone else, I had to say, wait, that actually wasn't in the 1927 article. That was something ChatGPT told me because it thought I wanted to hear it. I think. Who knows? Durkheim comes along in 1902, and the Durkheim syndrome, and it was also called adiposa dolorosa, and it was particularly painful fat deposits. This was an article that was published by Durkheim in the English language literature, a translation of the German article that was published. This is an example of a person who suffered from Durkheim's disorder, one of his cases. And again, what makes it stand out is the fat accumulation is painful to these people. And this was a very common observation that was reported in the literature. It's a noteworthy fact: the lower portions of the forearms and hands and the lower portions of the legs and feet are entirely free from all fatty deposit, the skin being here indeed so fine in texture that the tendons can be very readily discerned beneath. There's some fatty. You can see how they're thinking about fat accumulation. And they're publishing this in the literature because this is something physicians could publish in the literature. Here's a case, a unique, somebody came to me. They have this very peculiar fat accumulation. The fat accumulation is painful. I think it's adiposa dolorosa. It ended up being called Durkheim syndrome. And I'm going to report in the literature, and then later reports will be of more reports where somebody's found like 12 reports in the French literature and 5 reports in the Italian literature. Park Weber, British, I think, comes along and begins to report lipomatosis, which are lipomas, fatty tumors in patients. And not only do you get just one fatty tumor, often you get multiple fatty tumors and painful fatty tumor, symmetric fatty tumors. Park Weber, you read through this, he's reporting a single case. 52 shows typically diffuse lipomata of necks, arms, pubic region, and centuries. There's a slight general wasting, but no certain sign of disease of thoracic or abdominal viscera. The veins in the upper arms are considerably dilated. The man was formerly a car man. He's now been working. He often has been used for clinical demonstrations of this particular problem. As a boy, he was fat and used to be called Tubby. So was I got to tell you, it's interesting. With the last name like Taubes, it's hard to avoid. In 1909, Shattuck writes about, basically asks this question: we've got these lipomas, these fatty tumors that develop, and if you put one of these people with fatty tumors on a diet, they don't lose fat from the tumors. Okay, so these play a critical role in this thinking. If you could create a fat deposit that's resistant to weight loss, maybe they all are. Maybe there's something about the lipomas that is consistent through all obesity. Okay, this is what he says: whether there is really a difference in the physiological behavior of the fat of a lipoma and the rest of the body is a question for the answer to which more evidence is needed than is at present forthcoming. The belief rests mainly upon a case of Sha, where huge masses of fat existed on the head, throat, and chest of a man whose abdomen and legs were extremely thin. So they're now beginning to pay real close attention to the fact that fat accumulation doesn't have to be universal, and in fact usually isn't universal. It happens in very specific places. And they talk about steatopygia, which is this particular fat deposition in the buttocks mostly of women in sub-Saharan Africa. Fat-tailed mice is another one. Fat-tailed shrimp. These are animals that store their fat in specific parts of their body. They've evolved to store their fat in one place and not other. There's the fat deposit. Fat rum sheep are another one. Even in fish, this is a salmon, there's a particular fin on the salmon that has fat accumulation in it where the others don't. And the question is, what's controlling that? Cretinism, which is I don't know what the correct terminology is today, so I apologize if I'm being politically incorrect. It's a hypothyroid condition in the fetus, and it's characterized by mental retardation and also very specific fat deposits in the body. So what is it when these infants aren't producing enough thyroid hormone? It's not just that they get fatter because maybe their metabolism is too slow because they don't have the thyroid to accelerate their metabolism. Why is it only accumulating in specific places? And then there's something called Bichat's tissue, which is a fat deposit on your cheek that apparently helps a baby suck when they're nursing and is also resistant to any kind of dietary manipulation. So they talked about Bichat's tissue as well. In 1910, Gustav von Bergman, 1909, 1910, von Bergman starts off his career studying metabolism, and he's trying to demonstrate, he's measuring the metabolism in various patients, trying to demonstrate that people who get obese have a slow metabolism and people who have a slow metabolism get obese, and he can't do it. No one could do it at this period of time. They looked at all kinds of different metabolic phenomena, the increase in metabolism after eating that's called specific dynamic action, and the theory was maybe the obese subjects don't manifest the same amount of specific dynamic action, so they would feed them and measure their metabolism, and they would try to figure out who to compare them to, because the control patients are always very difficult to establish in these worlds. You don't have people who are of equal weight and not obese, but if you compare them to a lean person, you're confounding the experiment. So they discussed this, they debated this. They said maybe people who are obese expend less energy in physical activity, except they actually expend more energy in physical activity because they have to carry around all this excess fat. And it turned out that their metabolic rate was not necessarily lower, although it occasionally was. And there are also disorders like myxedema, which is a disorder of hypothyroid disorder. And those people have very slow metabolisms and often weren't obese. So Graf, finally by 1909, 1910, says, look, maybe it's got nothing to do with the metabolism. Maybe people who gain excess fat have some, he called it lipomatous tendency. He says, we are familiar with the active increase in adipose tissue in lipoma, even in obese individuals without actual lipoma formation. This hypothesis, which I refer to as lipomatous tendency, should be considered. Such a tendency for proliferation of adipose tissue may be determined in the germ, in the DNA, as a hereditary predisposition similar to skeletal growth pattern or inherited characteristics of other organs. It can occur as a pathological growth pattern similar to acromegaly, which is gigantism, multiple lipomas, etc. So maybe people who get fat as they get older are predisposed to do this, so maybe it's in their genes. And this lipomatous tendency is present in some of us and not all of us. It's stronger in some of us and weaker in others. And this is the real reason why people get fat. At the time, von Bergman still thought most people, well, clearly there are people who just eat too much. And he would write that off. But he voices this opinion. He writes a paper about it. Meanwhile, people start to discuss lipodystrophies, disorders of fat accumulation. This is a little bit what Shattuck was getting to. Simons in 1911 publishes the first case of what's called progressive lipodystrophy, which is a loss of fat, begins in the head and heads downward with time. And he publishes photos of a patient who's got this progressive lipodystrophy. They discuss the sort of witch-like appearance that the face takes on, while simultaneously a lower body stays shapely, let's call it that. Wilhelm Falta in 1916 is one of the leading Viennese authorities. So Vienna is one of the centers of all medical research At the period, he's one of the leading Viennese authorities on what's beginning to be called endocrine disorders. His book on it, which was translated into English, they call it the ductless glandular diseases, and he points out that people with diabetes can't store fat, and you need a functioning pancreas to store fat. And he calls it pancreatic obesity, which is a term that Van Noorden had used for a theory that was probably right. He says there must also accrue to the pancreas a direct influence on the assimilation of fat, not only because on the ingestion of abundant carbohydrates, a portion of these is converted into fats, but because in severe diabetes, the elimination of ketone bodies increases enormously on the administration of abundant fat. For fattening, therefore, is necessary a functionally intact pancreas. Okay, if you want to get fat, your pancreas better be working. This is all they could say at the time. They couldn't measure insulin. Insulin hadn't been discovered yet. Once insulin was discovered, you still couldn't measure insulin in the bloodstream with any accuracy at all, or effectively not at all until 1961. The origin of obesity may receive an impetus through a primarily strengthened function of the insular apparatus, and that the assimilation of large amounts of food goes on abnormally easily, and hence it does not occur the setting free of the reactions that a normal individual's work against an ingestion of food, which for a long time supersedes the need. So if Falta was right, the pancreas is part of this lipomatous tendency that Bergman had put forward. In 1920, Hans Gunther publishes a whole book on lipomas and lipodystrophies. Again, he goes through steatopygia, he goes through various lipodystrophies, and this fellow in particular, look at the fat accumulation around his neck, and you could also see the lipomas on his shoulders and upper arms. Here you could see the lipomas on his upper thighs. Symmetric. This is a woman with progressive lipodystrophy, and the photo, I assume, was taken like this to demonstrate how normal, if relatively lean, her upper body is compared to her lower body. I assume this is a real case, and we'll actually, I think I have photos later on of an individual who this may have been, but you see the specific fat accumulation, and the fact that the fat accumulation could be unilateral on one side of the body only begins to tell you that maybe the nervous system has to be involved here, okay? Because you can't explain it by some universal process. It has to be something that could separate, that could only affect one half of the body. Lichtwitz, 1923, began writing about obesity in the nervous system. Lichtwitz is one of the leading authorities on this field that was known as functional pathology, and learning about how the body works from the disease states that you can observe and the disorders that you could observe. Lichtwitz ended up emigrating to the US in the 1930s. He was working at Columbia. He published in English at the end of his career. In recent years, this is interesting. So this is another advantage the Germans and Austrians had, horrible as it is. One thing we don't think about here is that when you lose a war, particularly a world war, your social system completely breaks down. And so Germany and Austria, particularly Germany, suffered large-scale food deprivation, famine after World War I and again after World War II. And so they had people who were basically starving. In World War II in particular, I had to learn all this. I mean, it's crazy. This is what my life has become. From 1946 to 1948, basically every German, their fundamental purpose in life was trying to get enough food to get through the day, because their farm system, their agricultural system had broken down. Many of the farm workers had died in the war, and meanwhile 12 million displaced persons flooded back into the country and had to be fed. And this included a lot of people who had been in concentration camps that either the Germans ran or had been in concentration camps that the Russians ran and had to come back and be fed, and there wasn't food. And so they were starving. And in the midst of this, these people see obesity develop, okay? Particularly in women. Lichtwitz was fascinated by this. In recent years, the disease has appeared with a prevalence not previously observed before the war, which is of equal interest to metabolic pathologists and neurologists Endogenous adiposity. The disease affects exclusively the female gender. The symptoms are as follows: rapid onset of obesity not caused by changes in diet, primarily affecting the abdomen, hips, buttocks, and thighs, and to a lesser extent the breasts. The adipose tissue in untreated cases is almost always painful. At the end of World War II, in one of the reports I got, they were discussing these women who would get obese while their family was starving, and the guilt they felt because everybody assumed that they were pilfering food, when again, all of their life was about getting enough food to get fat. So when you're witnessing this, it's hard to blame obesity and overeating. By using the term endogenous, Lichtwitz is still saying maybe these cases are separate from the usual. But if you want to try and explain these cases, maybe it's the stress, maybe it's depression, maybe it's something that's generating this nervous system effect that's causing fat accumulation. In the US, we didn't have to worry about that. So our physicians never thought that way. They assumed that people got fat, ate too much. Such observations lead to considering the problem of adiposity from the perspective of the target organ, adipose tissue. It is known that adipose tissue in various parts of the body behaves differently in terms of the chemical composition of fat and water content. The distribution of fat dependent on gender and the neuroendocrine apparatus indicates that adipose tissue is under neurohormonal influence. It doesn't just fill up because you eat too much. Something that your nervous system is doing and something that your hormones are doing are controlling this thing. Pathological function of adipose tissue as a cause of obesity is the essence of von Bergmann's theory. According to this theory, obesity is based on a pathological greed for fat by cells which seize and retain fat, preventing normal breakdown. The patient says that everything turns into fat, leaving nothing for strength. 1923, by the mid-20s, the Germans and Austrians are fascinated with the genetics of obesity because they're seeing enough patients and they're asking their patients about their families and they're building social family trees because they begin to think this has to be a genetic disorder. And what they're seeing in their family trees is the concatenation, not just of obesity being passed from family to family, and they're building, like I said, family tree genetic graphs like this, but they're also seeing diabetes in the family, they're seeing hypertension in the family, they're seeing gout in the family. Clearly there's something about the families that is transmitting this from generation to generation. Meanwhile, we'll take a break, we'll cross the Atlantic, and we'll give you, this is the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, became the New England Journal of Medicine. This is Preble in 1923, reporting on what he learned from 1,000 cases. Most fat patients like to ascribe their conditions to heredity or to some peculiar quirk in their body chemistry or to some mysterious abnormality of their endocrine system. But examination of the literature and scientific investigation reveals the fact that the cause in the overwhelming majority of cases lies in their habits of eating. In other words, obesity is a habit, and a dangerous habit at that. Okay, this is even before Newberg. So I want you to see the sort of level of discourse in Germany and Austria and France and Italy compared to what our friends, our ancestors are writing. Let's get back to science. Fat in the nervous system, again, Goring, Erlang in 1924. Progressive lipodystrophy, okay, where you've got emaciation above the waist and obesity below the waist. You also had these patients who had spinal cord damage and become obese only below the waist. So the nervous system had to be playing a role. The question is, what is it? In 1924, Bauer publishes a second edition of his book, This is Julius Bauer, who was leaving German authority on genetics and constitutional diseases and endocrine disorders. Julius Bauer and Gustav von Bergmann were the leading thinkers in the field. Bauer publishes second edition of his textbook, and he publishes an article. He lectures in the United States, and he publishes an article in this bulletin of the Association for the Study of Internal Secretions. Again, he says, look, there are people who are just born thin. They have a thin habitus. They're always going to be thin. And there are people who are born fat. They called it arthritis because, again, in this combination of gout, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, arthritis was one of those diseases. They kind of saw it as an inflammatory disorder. Here's a eunuchoid obesity, and the interesting thing with the eunuchs is sometimes they're very tall and sometimes they're very fat. In pure cases of enucleoid obesity, the localization and distribution of the subcutaneous fatty tissue is the characteristic feature. Accumulation of fat around the hips and the lower abdominal regions, especially above the genital organs and the buttocks, breasts, and thighs, resembling closely the fat distribution of normal females, characterizes this type of enucleoidism. So you remove the testicles and you end up with somebody who puts on fat, very much like women typically put on fat. And pointed out also that in obese children, boys tend to fatten in a very sort of female-like fat accumulation pattern until they hit puberty. So it tells you that maybe the testicles and whatever they're secreting, whatever that sex hormone is, testosterone, is somehow controlling not just the amount of fat, but the distribution of fat. This is symmetric lipomas. If you look at the upper arms on this photo, you see that this fellow has lipomas, but only in very specific places, and they're symmetrical. So again, is the nervous system doing something that would cause that kind of symmetry? Here's a fat accumulation in the lower arm only in this case. Here's fat accumulation. If you look at his face, you could see the left side, that side. The face is far fuller than it is on the other side. Clearly something is determining, is some aspect of the body now is only working symmetrically to determine fat accumulation. The hands of these myxedema patients we talked about earlier are particularly fatty and thick, and they would see the skeletons. You could also get various sexual characteristics on only one side of the body. In this case, this is a boy on the left with the breast on one side of his body, and this is a person who's only growing hair on one side of his body. So they saw this all as the sex hormones are controlling it, they're interacting with the nervous system in some way, and it's all determining, just like these cases where you can grow hair in one place and not other, you could also put on fat in one place and not others, and maybe this is what's going on in obesity as well. And here's a family in which all 4 women have different growth disorders. Though the development of an obesity may be due to an endocrine disorder, it must be added that the same kind of endocrine trouble is not always followed by the same clinical consequences, and particularly not by the same degree of obesity. There are cases in which castration in a female produces a marked obesity, other cases in which no increase of weight has occurred. It is not a single endocrine gland only, but the total of all of them combined with the constitutional chromosomal reactivity of every body cell that determines the consequences of an endocrine trouble. So you're looking at basically the interaction of all these different hormones, the nervous system, and every cell, or at least every tissue, responding differently. It's a very astute observation of what endocrinology eventually evolved to be, and yet it had no effect on how we came to think of obesity. Frederick Umber in 1925 writes about a regional obesity and lipomas. And again, these are all very lengthy monographs I'm showing you. There is nothing like it in the United States. Nothing at all. The World War and its fateful consequences have unhappily delayed the long-needed revision of this present book. Okay, all of this was delayed by a decade because of the conflicts, and eventually it would vanish because of the conflicts. And again, he goes through the same thing. So regional obesity and lipomas, he's pointing to specific fat deposits on this women. He's talking about progressive lipodystrophy. He's talking about Froelich's disorder. He's another case of adiposa dolorosa with that, remember we talked about the thin tissue. It can actually be pulled out like this by these patients, or multiple photos. Regional lipomas, again, you could see them on the upper arms, and then the distinctive buffalo hump at the back of the neck. Something is controlling all of this. And it has nothing to do with how much people eat and exercise. The undoubtedly endocrine system triggered impetus for the development of this regional lipophilia. Lipophilia means love of fat. It's a phrase that Julius Bauer used to describe von Bergmann's lipomatous tendency. So certain parts of the body want to accumulate fat, other parts of the body don't. Okay, we all know that on ourselves. We just have to look in the mirror, and then whatever it is that's annoying us that day is probably a lipophilic tissue. These then become the site of abnormally increased definitive fat, which is thus pulled out of the intermediate metabolism. This is also why these cases of regional obesity are so difficult to influence through diet. They cover the caloric deficit of therapeutic malnutrition with body fat from their normal, but not from their lipophilic body regions. So if you've got that part of the body that wants to hold on to fat, it will try to hold on to fat even during calorie restriction. It might actually accumulate fat during food deprivation, as these people were seeing in the post-war famine years. Such patients are therefore no more outside the energetic basic laws of their overall metabolism than a metabolically healthy person with a circumscript lipoma. In this sense, I believe that the concept of the lipomatous tendency of adipose tissue by von Bergman is quite accurate. In 1926, Friedrich Wassermann solved that debate I told you about between Tolt and Wassermann in 55 years earlier and published a 100-page paper on the fat organ. Wassermann was also emigrated to the US in the late 1930s, ended up the only job he could get was at a dental clinic in Chicago, so he ended up doing dental research. By the way, I see that I've talked for 45 minutes. I've got about another 15 minutes. If anyone doesn't find this gripping, I will not take it the wrong way if you leave early. If you're wondering whether I could keep it up. Adipose, not only are adipose cells and adipose tissue unique tissues, but Wassermann demonstrated where they came from, how they started out in life, what the pre-adipocytes were, and basically settled a 50-year debate that it was not connective tissue, but by that time, like I said, the connective tissue idea had sort of settled into the zeitgeist. It was hard to get rid of it. Ernst Wertheimer in 1926 through 31 published 10 papers in the journal talking about the neuroendocrine regulation of fat storage. Boom, 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 boom. That's about 6 of the 10. Wertheimer broke this field over. He later became sort of the father of the field of adipose tissue regulation. He ended up emigrating to Palestine, to Tel Aviv, or Jerusalem, I forget which, and ending his career there. He was still alive in the 1960s to write review articles about this work, just as Wassermann was. Davenport, the first genetic mouse model of obesity showed up in 1927. You had to explain the fact that obesity was passed on in families, why it was so common, why an obese child was so likely to have a parent who was obese, and why obese parents were so likely to have children who were obese. And the conventional wisdom in the United States was that the overweight, obese parents taught the kids to eat too much. Basically, that they had a tradition of gorging at the table, and they passed it on that way. But already by 1927, there was a genetic mouse model of obesity where you couldn't imagine the mice teaching this to their pups. So it had to be genetic. Of course, the people in the US who believed that obesity was caused by overeating just said, well, these are mice. It doesn't matter. But in Germany, Europe, they said, wait a minute, if we have a mouse model that we know is genetic obesity, then maybe that's what's happening in humans too. Okay, these are the obese mice on the left and the lean mice on the right. Richter, 1929, writing about obesity and overweight. I just love this quote. The concept of adiposity presents today, in contrast to the past, a challenging metabolic problem. This problem did not exist when weight gain was primarily assumed to occur for purely mechanical and calculative reasons, meaning an increase in weight due to a discrepancy between intake and expenditure or consumption, resulting in nutrition obesity or inactivity-related obesity. For a long time, progress in this field was hindered by the view of many metabolic pathologists that echoed Mephistopheles' words. What you do not count, you believe does not exist. What you do not weigh has no weight for you. What you do not measure, you believe is insignificant. This, by the way, I asked ChatGPT where this quote came from. I said, where in Faust is this quote? And ChatGPT said it's not in Faust. So I rephrased the question using the original German, and it said, oh, it's not, excuse me, it actually apologized. I apologize for the inconvenience, but It's not in Goethe's Faust, it's in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. And then it told me which character said it to which character in which context. And then I did some more research, and it wasn't Goethe's Faust, it was completely wrong. And I didn't have the heart to tell it. The other aspect is if you look at the best English translations of Goethe's Faust, they translate it differently. And their translation, the one that's considered the best from 1987, is good, but it's not as appropriate as this one is. So I'm wondering if ChatGPT translated this to make me happy. And I don't know what the answer is. Okay. October 17, 1929. So the German Society of Digestive Diseases and Metabolism has a conference in 1929, October 16th through 18th in, I think it was Berlin. Okay, it's the big conference of the year. The morning session on the October 17th is on obesity and leanness or anorexia. There are two speakers. Tannhauser, who's also been writing, all these people when they write book chapters at the time are always Fettsucht und Magersucht, which is obesity and leanness or anorexia, depending on how you want to translate it, because they think they could be very similar. One's a disorder of excess fat accumulation, one's a disorder of insufficient fat accumulation. They have this conference, morning session, obesity, all the leading authorities are there. Bauer talks for what must have been 2 hours because the paper he wrote on the report that's in this proceedings that I had to buy from Germany and have shipped and scanned in myself is 12,000 words. And by this point, this theory of lipophilia and lipomatous tendencies and obesity being a neuroendocrine disorder is being accepted in Europe. This is what's discussed only at that conference. And again, all the leading authorities are there, so afterwards they have the discussion period where they ask them to opine on what they believe, and of course the ones who always believed it was metabolic problems said, well, how come Bauer thinks that humans don't follow the laws of thermodynamics? And Bauer has to say, but I'm not saying that, of course they do. We can summarize that in the vast majority of cases of obesity, endogenous factors are more or less causally effective. We rarely have to decide between exogenous and endogenous, but rather assess to what extent, and especially by what pathogenic mechanism endogenous factors have led to obesity. That is how endogenous obesity is developed. So you have this problem that some people eat a lot and get fat, and some people don't eat a lot and get fat. And so the idea is you have to have this lipomatous tendency, and if you have it, you will put on fat anyway, although you might put on fat more readily if you eat more. And if you've got a lot of lipomatous tendency, that might drive you to want to eat more. But basically, you've got to start with a constitutional predisposition to get fat. And potentially all cases of obesity are endogenous or constitutional. But 6 months before this, Newberg had published his paper in the US claiming that all obesity is exogenous, okay, and claiming to prove it experimentally with his 6 patients, and doing it in 3 different papers. Obesity is always caused by an overabundant inflow of energy. The excess is deposited as adipose tissue. This disproportion arises from a variety of conditions. First group includes the various human weaknesses, such as overindulgence and ignorance. The second group is composed of those who, for whatever reason, they've gotten older, they're expending less energy, but they haven't reined in their appetite. There is no specific metabolic abnormality in obesity. All obesity is simple obesity. The increase in weight merely represents an inflow of energy greater than the outflow. Failure of the primitive instinct to adjust the inflow of energy to the bodily needs is always the immediate cause of both leanness and obesity. In the midst of this, Bauer actually published a paper in the English language literature with a young endocrinologist who had been working in Germany and Austria named Solomon Silver, who was at, I forget if it was Mount Sinai or must have been Mount Sinai, arguing that this American conception of energy balance was nonsense, but then Newberg came along afterwards with this JAMA article. Meanwhile, the European This was still the early 1930s, so European biomedical science was still mostly flourishing. Hausberger in 1935 is writing about the nervous regulation of fat tissue, which they're now able to, by severing the nerves in animal models, you could see what happens to fat accumulation. So the fat cells on the left in this picture are normal fat cells. The fat cells on the right are an animal that's been food deprived, but has had the nerves to the fat cells severed, so that it accumulates fat in those fat cells even though the animal is currently food deprived. Since most researchers believed that the problem of fat storage could be resolved purely from a balanced perspective, and they largely overlooked the local peripheral phenomena as merely secondary consequences, for the first time we were able to extensively demonstrate the nature of the nervous regulation of fat depots and its significance within the overall organism. We believe that considering the fat tissue as an organ system with its typical structure and unique metabolic functions would be advantageous for all fat metabolism-related problems, except in the US, where obesity is caused by ignorance and self-indulgence. 1930, Schonheimer is a German Jewish refugee who came to the US in 1933, went to work for Harold Urey's laboratory in Columbia. He was Schonheimer was already a well-known biochemist. Urey had discovered deuterium, for which he would win the Nobel Prize. Schonheimer and Rindenberg figured out they could use deuterium to sort of figure out what's going on inside what's called the intermediary metabolism. So if you're studying energy expenditure and intake, you're studying what goes into the body and what comes out, but you're paying no attention to what's happening in the body. And the problem with what's happening in the body is as soon as somebody eats food or your animal eats food, you lose track of where it goes. That's what the intermediary metabolism is basically studying. So Schonheimer and Rindenberg created a way to tag the food that was eaten with deuterium, and then you could feed it to animals, and then you could sacrifice the animals at different points of time and see what's happening to this. Okay, this was the revolutionary discovery of the 1930s, a new tool that was necessary to begin to piece together intermediary metabolism. 1948, I'm skipping ahead quickly. Wertheimer, who's now in Israel, Palestine, writes the seminal review of adipose tissue metabolism, everything that's been learned, 90% of this by Germans and Austrians, and some Frenchmen, and some Scandinavians, and some Italians, and a few Americans. And it's an article called The Physiology of Adipose Tissue, and they say the classical theory that fat is deposited in the adipose tissue only when given an excess of the caloric requirement has been finally disproved. The fat tissue accumulates fat almost independent of how much is eaten or how much exercise. It disassociated from it. Mobilization, deposition of fat go on continuously without regard to the nutritional state of the animal. But by that time, energy balance has won out, okay? And the reason when that's interesting, so Bauer also flees Austria in 1938. He's a Jew. Wertheimer was a Jew. Wasserman was a Jew. Hausberger was a Jew. They all left. Hausberger ended up at Thomas Jefferson. Wasserman ended up, as I said, first at a dental research institute in Chicago and then at the Argonne National Laboratory. Bauer comes to the US in 1938 and he finds out that these people actually believe Newberg. And I mean, you can read it in his article. He's kind of stunned by this. The problem is he comes to the US. First he goes to Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, and he stays there for a year. He had an invitation from someone. I could imagine that after Vienna, Baton Rouge was a bit of a letdown. So he goes to Los Angeles. He gets a job with the College of Medical Evangelists, and he's writing papers where his idea is Julius Bauer, Hollywood, California. And you could imagine how much oomph that gave in the sort of Ivy League dominated world of academic medicine. And he says the usual conception of obesity, particularly in the United States, is that it's always caused by an imbalance between intake and output of energy. This conception of obesity has been substantiated chiefly by Newberg and Johnston, sorry for the typo, and almost universally accepted on account of its promulgation by leading authorities, yet it is not satisfactory. And he Goes through all the reasons, including all the things it can't explain, many of which we've been talking about the Germans and Austrians studying. He says it's the distribution of energy in the body too which counts, not alone the rough imbalance between its intake and output. The adipose tissue is not merely a passive storing place for research fat, but a living and active part of the body with its own physiological and pathological processes. So he basically wraps up, when Wertheimer did it in 1948, he was just talking about the science of adiposity. Bauer puts it in the context of obesity 7 years earlier. But a year after he writes his article, Newberg responds. Okay, Bauer's article was about 20 pages long. Newberg's article was 64 pages long. And he says, this is all he says about everything I have talked about today. The suggestion of von Bergmann, he spells his name incorrectly, which I always admire when you're dismissing somebody's entire career, make sure you spell his name wrong. So volubly defended by Bauer that the fat cells of obese persons possess an abnormally great avidity for fat and exaggerated capacity for retaining it finds no support in experiments designed to test its validity. Bodybuilders' inherited obesity is not. With that, he kills this theory. The understanding of obesity will be advanced by making a list of proximate causes to which some persons respond in part by overeating, overemphasis by a parent of the importance of food in a child's upbringing, gratification obtained from the flavor of foods, the feeling of repose and comfort produced by a full stomach, the temporary respite, I love this one, from anguish caused by intellectual, social, or sexual failure, the food habits of youth, disabling disease with its lessened energy. So the answer to the question, why this? Why in 2023 are we still arguing about whether obesity is a biology over willpower, is this. This is the citations to Bauer's article on the bottom in green, which gathered 10 citations by 1959 and then not again for 40 years. And Newberg's, which came the basis, Newberg wrote another paper in 1944. They were the seventh and ninth most cited papers of the 1940s. This was what obesity research in the US was built on. And it's a German obesity medical research society basically vanished with World War II and then took a decade to come back. And when it came back, it was a shadow of its former self, in part because many of the fundamental thinkers in the field had left and fled Germany and others had died during the war. The US thinking took over the world. And for the next 50 years, and I've talked about this before, theories of obesity, like the primary theories of obesity in the United States, were theories of why fat people eat too much. The glucostatic theory and the lipostatic theory were all theories trying to explain why we didn't rein in our appetites. And that became, by the 1960s, obesity research was dominated by psychologists and psychiatrists, and everything that's followed. And now that we have a drug that can work on fat accumulation, people are willing to say, well, maybe it was a biology. Thank you.
I don't know, your presentation, you try to see, people find the reason to justify why people are obese, right? But, when you present genetic disease, endocrine disorder, even nervous disorders, those are rare diseases.
That's true.
Not prevalent. And not only that, they might have died out. Darwin said, the survival of the fittest, right? So you don't expect this disease to prevail.
No, let me, because actually it's funny. One thing I skipped over to make progress is I had pointed out this was about thinking, a sort of spotlight theory on thinking, okay? So Popper basically divided science into the bucket theory of science and the spotlight theory. So the bucket theory, you have these observations, you throw them in a bucket and you hope something interesting comes out of it. The spotlight theory, you have a theory or a hypothesis that has you interpret the observations through that hypothesis. So the two spotlights in this field were the idea of energy balance, being the driving force or a neuroendocrine disorder being the driving force. If you're an energy balance person, you say, look, these are all rare disorders. Like, all these people get fat. If I had time, I would have tried to figure out how to do pie charts. I'm not very, like, that's not my first language. But one way to think about it, and you find this in the textbooks in the US, there are all these unique disorders, and this one's caused by castration, and this one's a nervous system disorder, and they tell us nothing about obesity in general, and most people get fat because they eat too much. And the way these Germans and Austrians said is, let's see what we could learn about fat accumulation from all these disorders, and then see if what we learn teaches us why everyone else gets obese. So indeed, they all are unique and rare disorders, but they are teaching you about fat accumulation, and that was all they had at the time, is the study of these disorders. And as new tools like Schonheimer and Rittenberg's technology came in, then they could start using other tools. You could start denervating, removing cutting the nervous system to fat cells. You could start using other tools to understand what's regulating this. So they were putting it all together and saying, what we're learning from this tells us something about everything. And then the question is, were they right?
No, the only thing, because he asked me not to say too much. My final comment may be, this is from Dr. Phil, so I don't really like him, but I want to quote him. He said, if we don't acknowledge the problem, we will not fix it. So we need to acknowledge the real causes of obesity and not try to use other things, other excuses to justify it. If we don't, so I hope.
Well, again, there are two. Remember the first quote from Virchow that I had. Even with people who eat a lot and are obese, those are two phenomena that associate with each other. But that doesn't tell you that eating a lot causes the obesity. In fact, the obesity could cause the eating a lot, or the same underlying metabolic disruption that causes both excess fat accumulation and excess hunger or eating. Hyperphagia is a technical term, and then what you're looking for is the underlying metabolic, hormonal, endocrine, nervous, whatever it is, disruption. And one of the problems in the US, like I said, is we just decided that we could blame it all on eating too much. And worse than that, we decided that the laws of thermodynamics somehow established that had to be true. And so the question is, maybe overweight is always a neuroendocrine problem, and then what you're doing with drugs like GLP-1A, for instance, is you're attacking the underlying neuroendocrine disorder. You're not just getting people to eat less. When the people eat less and they take the drugs, maybe again, that's because you're attacking something that's beneath them, that's causing both the fat accumulation and the appetitive behavior.
That may have just answered it. I was going to ask, how have your thoughts changed based on this research that you did and all the other research you've done, sugar and all that? What's changed in how you put the pieces together?
As you can see, I'm becoming a self-hating American. A legitimate criticism would be that I established a bias early. One thing you want to do in any scientific endeavor is fight as hard as you can against your own biases and belief system and your own hypotheses. So once I established a hypothesis that I believe that this is not a overeating disorder, that you can't explain anything with the word overeating, you can't even measure overeating, it's a meaningless terminology, that then I went into the literature and found what I needed to support my belief system. And that could be true. You hope it isn't, but it certainly could be. And then when I write the book that I'll write on this, I will try and phrase things in such a way that I acknowledge the possibility that that could be happening and that I'm missing large portions of this literature. There were certainly people through the 1930s, one of them, Eric Graf in particular, who was a leading metabolism researcher, who continued to believe that obesity was caused by endogenous, the same things that Van Noorden had said all along. But when you put all this together and then go follow the science into the 1960s, it's the same story that I told in Good Calories, Bad Calories. Again, either because that's the only story I'll accept or because that's the story that's there. And I can't swear that I don't have the usual confirmation biases. And then you tie it up to insulin and glucagon. And the one thing that's been left out almost entirely is the neural issue, which is fascinating because you see even with discussions like when they run genome scans to see what genes associate with obesity, and then they say, well, we found genes that associate, and they primarily manifest themselves in the brain and the nervous system, therefore they work to make people eat too much. And then we have to say, well, wait a minute, wait. Since Claude Bernard in 1865, we've known that the nervous system has a fundamental effect on metabolism, intermediary metabolism. And, in 1865, Claude Bernard showed that if you puncture, I think it was the fourth ventricle of the brain, then the liver spills glycogen into the bloodstream. Okay? So you have this very consistent story that's still being, the way when you read about, if you read this Wall Street Journal article, there's an article in the New York Times yesterday by Gina Colada about what they don't know about GLP-1A. And the idea is one thing it does is work in the brain to make people eat less. But there's an entire field called physiological psychology that came to the conclusion that basically appetitive behavior, hunger and satiety, is the brain responding to whether liver cells are storing or running through ATP. Okay, and nobody reads about that. Those people did that research, didn't tie their research to obesity. But their research says if you look at the liver, then you've got somebody who's eating less and losing weight, let's see what these drugs are doing in the liver, and then you have something you could actually test comparing these two hypotheses. But if you go back and read my books, basically the argument is because of World War II, the science of obesity, of excess fat accumulation, split off from the science of adiposity, of fat accumulation. And when it did that, it ended up, a situation 70 years later where you've got these obesity epidemics worldwide. The assumption is people just eat too much, and therefore we need drugs that'll get us to eat less, and that's what GLP-1 agonists do. Anyway, I wouldn't believe me either, so. You're welcome.
I was curious if you continued reading into 1940s German literature and 1950s German literature, because I haven't seen any pictures from concentration camps and these people being obese from stress.
Actually, it's interesting. No, I couldn't find any pictures either. I only found the one report, 1948. People were writing, again, famine was so prevalent. Malnutrition, they called it hunger edema in Germany post-World War II. But in those works, there was people discussing the appearance of obesity. Weirdly enough, I actually was watching Ken Burns' documentary, The Holocaust in America, which is incredibly powerful and depressing. And the videos of people leaving the concentration camps, I still can't believe I saw what I saw, but I believe I saw people who had excess fat on their bodies. But that was always the excuse. I mean, when I was doing my research for Good Calories, Bad Calories, that's what the obesity, there were no obese people in the concentration camps. So the idea that if you starve someone for 5 years, they lose weight, it doesn't mean that they got fat to begin with because they ate too much. Okay, one way to ask the question is, why is it some people can maintain a healthy weight effortlessly, eating as much as they want, and other people, in order to weigh as much as the lean person, has to eat, 1,200 or 1,000 calories a day only? And, there are ways to phrase the question which the answer isn't, well, there were no obese people in the concentration camps. Okay?